Rebecca Harper and Daniel Harper too, names that should have represented a family bond, instead became bound together in a secret affair that spiraled into a chilling murder. Behind the walls of a picture-perfect home, a stepmother's seduction and a stepson's weakness grew into a twisted plan that ended with the brutal killing of the man who trusted them most. This isn't just the story of betrayal, it's the story of how love, obsession, and manipulation can turn a family into a nightmare. Thomas Harper was admired by many in the quiet suburban town where he lived. He had built his business from the ground up, turning a small local company into a respected firm. After the death of his first wife, people pitied him, but also respected his strength in moving forward. When he remarried Rebecca, a woman younger and full of charm, many believed he had finally found peace again. From the outside, their home looked like a portrait of recovery. Rebecca carried herself with elegance, always smiling at neighbors and presenting herself as the perfect wife. Thomas's teenage son, Daniel, however, was not convinced. Still struggling with the loss of his mother, Daniel kept his distance from Rebecca, though he remained polite enough to avoid conflict. To most, the Harpers appeared to be a family slowly healing, but behind closed doors, something far more complicated was taking shape. Rebecca had a way of inserting herself into Daniel's life. She often found reasons to talk with him while Thomas was away at work. What started as small conversations about school or casual hobbies soon grew into long, late-night talks where Rebecca listened intently and made Daniel feel seen in a way his father never managed to. Daniel's grief and confusion created the perfect opening for Rebecca, who thrived on control and attention. She began to blur boundaries, flattering him, touching his arm a little too long, making him feel like he was more than just a stepson. Slowly, a dangerous bond was forming, though neither of them admitted it outright at first. Thomas remained blind to these changes. His focus was entirely on maintaining his business, traveling for meetings, and ensuring financial stability. He often assumed Rebecca was simply trying to bridge the gap with Daniel, easing his struggles as a stepmother should. In truth, Rebecca was creating a secret life, one fueled by forbidden desire and manipulation. She recognized Daniel's vulnerabilities and leaned into them, feeding him ideas that he was special and misunderstood. For a teenager desperate for acceptance, it was intoxicating. The age gap and the taboo nature of their relationship only made it more powerful. Rebecca's obsession grew quietly, but steadily. She relished the control she had over both men in the house. Thomas, who depended on her presence to maintain his image of a complete family, and Daniel, who was falling into her trap of emotional dependence. To the outside world, she was a devoted wife and stepmother, always presentable, always polite. Inside the Harper home, however, the foundation was cracking. The walls that once sheltered a grieving family were now holding a secret that would one day spill out in the most violent way. By the time neighbors began to notice Daniel spending more time with Rebecca, it was already too late. The line between family roles and dangerous passion had blurred beyond recognition. What looked like a normal household to outsiders was, in truth, the beginning of a story that would end in betrayal, obsession, and murder. Rebecca's influence over Daniel tightened as weeks turned into months. What had begun as simple emotional manipulation now took on a darker tone. She had learned exactly how to make Daniel feel indispensable to her, convincing him that she relied on him in ways Thomas never could. She would whisper to him about how lonely she felt when Thomas traveled, how neglected she was, and how only Daniel understood her. These carefully planted seeds reshaped the boy's loyalty, redirecting his need for comfort away from his father and fully toward her. To Daniel, it felt like love, but to Rebecca, it was control. The affair began quietly, shielded from the outside world by the walls of the Harper home. Rebecca calculated every move to ensure that Thomas remained oblivious. When Daniel's friends invited him out, she urged him to stay home. When Thomas worked late at the office, she arranged dinners that felt more like romantic encounters and family meals. It wasn't just about desire for her. It was about power, about creating a secret world that only she and Daniel shared. This hidden relationship gave her a sense of thrill. But it also sparked something more dangerous: resentment toward her husband. Thomas remained unaware, too preoccupied with his work and his reputation in the community to notice the subtle changes in his household. He trusted Rebecca fully, often praising her to others as the reason his family had survived tragedy. His words only fed her ego, making her feel untouchable. Meanwhile, Daniel began to struggle with annoying guilt. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but Rebecca always found a way to twist his doubts into reassurance. She convinced him that they were victims of circumstance, that their connection was special, and that no one else would ever understand. As the months passed, Rebecca's ambitions grew. She began to hint at a future where she and Daniel could be together without secrecy. These suggestions were always vague at first, but they planted dangerous ideas in Daniel's mind. If Thomas were no longer around, their love wouldn't have to hide in shadows. Rebecca never said the words directly, but her tone, her lingering looks, and her carefully chosen phrases pushed Daniel closer to that conclusion. For a teenager so deeply under her influence, it was only a matter of time before he believed it was his own idea. The cracks in the family dynamic started to show in small, subtle ways. Neighbors noticed Daniel withdrawing more from his peers. At school, teachers remarked on his distracted behavior and his sudden drop in grades. To outsiders, it looked like the lingering effects of grief. But inside the home, it was the weight of Rebecca's manipulation pressing down on him. She thrived on his dependence, using it as a weapon to bend him to her will. By now, Rebecca's charm had transformed into something predatory. She had successfully woven herself into Daniel's emotions, created distance between him and Thomas, and fostered an illusion of intimacy that bound him to her. The stage was quietly being set for something far darker than an affair. Beneath the calm exterior of the Harper household, the early sparks of a twisted murder plot were beginning to ignite. Rebecca had perfected her act of being the caring wife and devoted stepmother, but inside, she was growing restless. The secrecy of the affair thrilled her at first, but soon it became a burden. She despised having to wait for stolen moments, having to hide every glance and touch when Thomas was near. She wanted more, and her ambitions began to take shape in the form of carefully calculated conversations with Daniel. She would never say the words directly, but she knew exactly how to push him toward the conclusion she desired. It started with complaints. Rebecca would sigh heavily when Thomas left for work, telling Daniel how much she hated being alone with a man who barely noticed her anymore. She described her marriage as lifeless, cold, and unfulfilling. Every complaint made Thomas sound less like a husband and more like an obstacle. She layered these stories with reminders of how special Daniel was, how much more connected she felt to him, how her life was brighter only because of him. This mixture of flattery and discontent poisoned Daniel's thoughts, making him believe that his father was the enemy of their happiness. Rebecca's subtle manipulations grew more daring. One night, she asked Daniel if he ever imagined a life where it was just the two of them, without secrets or fear. His silence was all the encouragement she needed. She didn't need him to answer. She could see the conflict on his face, the guilt battling with desire. Instead of pressing further, she let the question linger, planting it deep inside him, where it would grow on its own. The next day, she returned to her routine as if nothing had been said, knowing that silence often worked more effectively than persuasion. Daniel began to internalize her hints, turning them over in his mind late at night. He started to picture scenarios in which Thomas wasn't part of their lives anymore. At first, it horrified him. But the more Rebecca painted Thomas as a careless husband who didn't value her, the easier it became to justify those thoughts. Slowly, the unthinkable transformed into something that felt inevitable. Rebecca never had to force the idea onto him. She simply nurtured his doubts until they blossomed into dangerous fantasies. The tension in the house thickened. Thomas remained oblivious, still proud of his ability to balance business and family, completely unaware of the storm brewing under his roof. Daniel grew more distant, his gaze colder whenever he looked at his father. Rebecca encouraged this silence, often rewarding him with affection whenever he pulled away from Thomas. In her mind, she was tightening the bond between them, ensuring that Daniel would eventually act in her favor. What Rebecca didn't realize was that Daniel's turmoil was carving deep scars into his psyche. The boy she manipulated was no longer just grieving. He was unraveling under the pressure of loving his stepmother and hating his father. Rebecca thought she was in control, but her dangerous game was creating a monster of her own making. The shift from forbidden love to murderous intent had already begun, and neither of them would ever be the same again. Rebecca knew she could not openly tell Daniel what she wanted, but she also knew he was nearing a breaking point. His behavior had become unpredictable, alternating between obsessive devotion and deep resentment toward his father. She began to test his reactions, introducing small scenarios to measure how far he was willing to go. One evening, she casually mentioned how much money Thomas had in life insurance, pretending it was just part of normal household talk. She watched Daniel's face closely, noting the way his jaw tightened, the way his silence grew heavier. She didn't need words to confirm that the seed she planted was taking root. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca carefully constructed opportunities for Daniel to think about life without Thomas. She told him stories about women who had been trapped in unhappy marriages only to find freedom after tragedy struck. She would pretend these were stories she had heard from friends or the news, but they were all part of her design. Each story painted a picture of survival and new beginnings, making Daniel believe that losing Thomas wasn't just possible, it was a path to happiness. Daniel, overwhelmed with conflicting emotions, began spending more time alone in his room. He avoided his father whenever possible, finding excuses to skip meals or lock himself away under the pretense of homework. Rebecca used these absences to her advantage, whispering into his mind every chance she got. She told him that Thomas didn't truly care for either of them, that he was a selfish man who lived only for his own ambitions. She framed Thomas as the wall between their love, making Daniel feel as though removing him was the only way forward. The plot started to take shape when Rebecca began hinting at how vulnerable Thomas could be. She pointed out his predictable routines, how he left early for the office before sunrise, how he often worked late into the night and returned home exhausted. She mentioned his habit of forgetting to lock the back door, as though it was careless rather than harmless. Each observation was made casually, but each one was a piece of the blueprint she was constructing in Daniel's mind. Daniel wrestled with guilt, but Rebecca was always there to soothe him. She would remind him of how much she loved him, how much they deserved to be free. Her touch, her smile, her reassurance, all of it worked to dull the horror of the thoughts growing inside him. He began to imagine himself as her protector, the one who would sacrifice everything to keep her happy. What had once felt impossible now seemed like destiny, twisted by her manipulative influence. While Thomas carried on blissfully unaware, Rebecca and Daniel's secret world grew darker. The conversations they shared became less about affection and more about possibility. It was no longer about if something happened to Thomas, but when Rebecca never had to say the words directly. Her silences, her knowing glances, and her carefully chosen remarks carried more weight than any demand ever could. By the time winter set in, the Harper household had transformed into a quiet battlefield. One man lived unaware, one woman pulled the strings, and one boy stood on the edge of making a choice that would end a life and destroy what little innocence he had left. The murder plot was no longer a shadow, it was a presence waiting for the right moment to strike. The night Daniel finally began to prepare himself for action came quietly, without warning. The house was wrapped in its usual silence. The ticking of the old clock in the hallway filling the air as Thomas sat in his study, buried in paperwork. Rebecca drifted between rooms with a calm, deliberate grace. Her movements calculated to give Daniel space, but also to keep her presence near enough to remind him of what they were working to. She didn't need to say anything that night. Her silence was encouragement enough. Daniel sat in his room staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The weight of what he was about to do pressed against his chest, but every time Dal threatened to take over, he thought about Rebecca. He replayed her words, her touches, the way she made him feel needed in a way his father never had. Those thoughts pulled him forward, convincing him that his actions would not be evil, but necessary. Slowly, he rose from his bed and opened the drawer where he had hidden a kitchen knife he had stolen days earlier. It was heavy in his hand, the cold metal sending a shiver through him. Rebecca had not told him directly to take the knife, but she had made sure he noticed where Thomas kept his alcohol late into the night, how distracted he became when he was working in his study, and how deep his sleep was after. These reminders were her way of shaping Daniel's path without pushing too hard. That night, Daniel sat with the knife, testing its sharpness, imagining the moment when everything would change. He wasn't ready yet, but preparation was the first step, and Rebecca had taught him that readiness was as important as the act itself. The following days, Daniel began to study his father's habits more closely. He noticed how Thomas always lingered in the kitchen after dinner, sipping a drink before retreating upstairs. He realized how often Thomas left his phone unattended, how predictable his routines had become. Each detail gave Daniel more confidence, convincing him that what he was planning could actually work. His guilt didn't vanish, but Rebecca's voice, her presence, and her promises dulled the edges of his conscience. Rebecca encouraged his growing confidence subtly. She would smile at him longer than usual, squeeze his hand when no one was watching, or tell him he was the only person who truly understood her. These gestures became his fuel, giving him the strength to keep moving forward. At times, Daniel thought she might be testing him, waiting to see if he would really follow through. The pressure mounted, and with each day, his mind shifted further from hesitation to grim determination. One evening, while Thomas fell asleep on the couch after a long day, Daniel crept close enough to watch his father's chest rise and fall. He tightened his grip on the knife hidden in his hoodie pocket, his heart hammering so loudly he thought it might wake him. But he froze, unable to move beyond that moment. He returned to his room, shaken, ashamed, but not deterred. He told himself it was only a matter of timing. Rebecca never scolded him for the delay. Instead, she caressed his face the next morning and whispered that some things couldn't be rushed. Her patience calmed him, but it also reminded him that the choice was still waiting. That week, Daniel made up his mind to be ready when the next opportunity came. He would not hesitate forever. The plan was no longer just in his head. It had started to become part of who he was. The night Daniel finally stepped beyond preparation was darker than usual, the house shrouded in an almost oppressive silence. Thomas had returned home late from a business meeting, weary and drained. And after his usual glass of whiskey, he disappeared into his study. Rebecca moved around the house quietly, careful not to draw attention to herself, but every so often, her eyes met Daniel's with a knowing look that carried more weight than words ever could. Daniel felt her unspoken command pushing him forward. He slipped into his room, retrieved the knife from its hiding place, and tucked it under his sweatshirt. His hands trembled, but the thought of Rebecca's approval steadied him enough to keep walking. He lingered in the hallway, listening to the faint scratch of Thomas's pen on paper inside the study. The door was partially closed, leaving a sliver of light cutting across the carpet. Daniel's breathing quickened. Each step toward the door felt like stepping into another version of himself, one he could no longer escape. His father's voice echoed in his memory lectures about discipline. Reminders of responsibility, words that once shaped him but now seemed distant, hollow. Rebecca's voice, soft and intoxicating, replaced them. She had told him he was strong, that he could change everything if he dared. That thought became his shield against the fear threatening to paralyze him. When Daniel finally pushed the door open, Thomas barely looked up. His father muttered something about being busy, his attention still buried in paperwork. Daniel stood in the doorway, his fingers gripping the knife, so tightly his knuckles whitened. For a moment, he thought about backing away, about retreating to the safety of his room, and pretending none of this had ever entered his mind. But then he remembered Rebecca's words, her touch, her promise of a future where they could be together without obstacles. That vision pulled him forward like gravity. He took a step closer, his shadow stretching across the floor toward his father. The knife gleamed under the dim desk lamp. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out every other sound. Just as he raised his hand, ready to plunge the blade downward, Thomas turned unexpectedly, his eyes locking with Daniel's. Shock and confusion filled his expression as he registered the weapon. The moment stretched into eternity. Father and son frozen in a stare that carried years of unspoken words. Daniel's hand shook violently, his breath ragged. But the look in Thomas's eyes hurt, rather than anger, broke through the haze of Rebecca's influence. Daniel stumbled back, dropping the knife onto the carpet with a dull thud. His chest heaved as he turned and fled from the room, slamming his door shut behind him. Sweat drenched his body, and his entire frame trembled as he collapsed onto his bed. He had come so close, closer than ever, but at the final moment, something inside him recoiled. Thomas remained in the study, stunned, staring at the knife on the floor, but saying nothing. Rebecca entered Daniel's room minutes later, her face unreadable. She sat beside him, her calm presence contrasting sharply with his panic. Instead of anger, she stroked his hair and whispered that everything was fine, that it wasn't failure, but simply another step. Her patience soothed him. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind was already turning, adjusting the plan. She would not let him falter forever. The seeds were planted too deep. The night might have ended without bloodshed, but the path forward was already too far gone to abandon. Daniel barely slept after that night, The image of his father's shocked eyes haunted him, replaying every time he closed his own. He had expected anger, maybe rage, but what he saw was something heavier: betrayal, sorrow, a kind of silent question that pierced deeper than any scolding ever had. Still, when morning came, Thomas said nothing. He acted as though nothing unusual had happened, eating breakfast quietly, preparing for work, and avoiding any direct conversation. That silence weighed on Daniel more than words ever could. It left him suspended in uncertainty, unsure whether his father had truly seen everything or chosen to ignore it. Rebecca, however, was not shaken. She moved through the house with calm determination, her presence almost unnervingly steady. When she spoke to Daniel, it was with the same softness that had kept him bound to her for months. She told him he had shown strength by even reaching that point. That hesitation was natural, and that greatness always came with trials. Her words carried no judgment, only reassurance, and that made them even more dangerous. Daniel found himself clinging to her approval like a drowning man to a rope. She began to plant new ideas into his mind, subtly shifting the approach. Instead of pushing him toward another direct confrontation, she suggested patience. She painted a picture of freedom that grew clearer with every conversation. Without Thomas, they could be together openly, living a life without secrets or fear. She described it with such vivid detail that Daniel could almost see Ida House by the coast. Late nights where no one questioned their closeness, mornings where no guilt hung over them. The fantasy became a refuge from his inner conflict, a place he returned to whenever doubt threatened to overwhelm him. But Rebecca also knew how to sharpen his resentment. She reminded him of every moment Thomas had belittled him, every rule enforced, every opportunity denied. She retold these memories like fables, each ending with the same conclusion: that Thomas had always stood in the way of Daniel's happiness. At first, Daniel resisted, recalling the kindness his father had shown too, but Rebecca's persistence wore him down. Soon, those darker memories eclipsed the brighter ones. In his mind, Thomas became less of a protector and more of a jailer. Someone who had taken years from him that could never be returned. Meanwhile, Thomas grew more withdrawn. He watched Daniel with cautious eyes, sensing something deeper was wrong, but unable to bridge the widening distance. His silence was not ignorance, but fear of pushing his son further away by confronting him too directly. That gap between father and son widened each day, and Rebecca slid into it seamlessly, filling the space with her influence. Daniel's guilt slowly transformed into resentment, and his hesitation began to harden into resolve. He no longer thought of the knife as a mistake, but as a trial he had failed, one he needed to correct. Rebecca never had to say the words outright. Her subtle guidance and careful praise were enough to push him toward that conclusion on his own. What once seemed unthinkable now felt like destiny. As days stretched into weeks, the tension inside the Harper household became unbearable. Thomas buried himself in work. Rebecca smiled as if nothing were wrong. And Daniel walked the halls like a ghost, consumed by the weight of what was to come. The failed attempt had not killed the plan, it had only refined it. Rebecca's hold on him was stronger than ever, and the path toward bloodshed was no longer a question of if, but when. The night of the final act came without warning, yet to Daniel, it felt like it had been building forever. The house was wrapped in silence, the kind that seemed to press down on the walls and settle into the corners. Thomas sat alone in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk beside him, his face drawn and tired. He looked older than his years, weighed down by suspicions he could not voice. The air between father and son had grown colder each day, but Thomas never confronted Daniel directly. That unspoken tension lingered like a storm on the horizon. Rebecca had orchestrated every detail with subtle precision. She knew Thomas's routines, the times when he was most vulnerable. The way he always retreated to his study late at night to lose himself in paperwork or memories. She didn't need to order Daniel anymore. The seeds she had planted had grown on their own, twisting through his thoughts until he believed the decision was his. She only reminded him of the life waiting beyond this house, a life without shadows or shame. It was enough to keep him steady. Danya entered the study with the knife hidden against his side. His heart pounded, but this time there was no hesitation, no trembling in his hands. His father looked up briefly, offering a tired smile that carried both affection and sadness. That single glance cut deeper than any reprimand ever could. For the briefest second, Daniel wavered. his grip tightening as if the conflict might split him in two. But then Rebecca's voice filled his memory, soothing and insistent, telling him this was the only way to truly be free. The act itself was fast, brutal, and final. The blade struck before Thomas could rise, before he could even register the full reality of what was happening. The glass of whiskey toppled to the floor, shattering against the wood as crimson spread across the papers on his desk. Daniel's breathing came in ragged bursts, but he did not stop until silence fell completely, until there was no movement left in the man who had raised him. Rebecca appeared, moments later, her calmness a stark contrast to Daniel's panic. She took the knife from his shaking hands, guiding him out of the room with practiced composure. Her touch was steady, almost tender, as though she were comforting him after a nightmare rather than leading him away from a crime scene. She whispered that everything would be fine, that together they would build the life they had always dreamed of. In her eyes, there was no grief, no remorse, only triumph, hidden behind a mask of control. The days that followed became a carefully constructed performance. Rebecca played the grieving widow flawlessly, her tears convincing enough to sway neighbors, friends, even the police at first glance. She spoke of Thomas's long hours, his stress, and suggested he may have collapsed from the weight of it all. But cracks began to show as investigators dug deeper. Detective Laura Mitchell noticed inconsistencies in Rebecca's statements, subtle hints of manipulation in Daniel's behavior, and a tension that could not be disguised by rehearsed grief. Daniel, once bound tightly to Rebecca, began to unravel under questioning. The image of his father's final expression returned in flashes, stronger now that the act was done. Guilt pressed harder than Rebecca's reassurances could ease. The fantasy she had painted seemed farther away each day, replaced with the reality of detectives circling closer. Rebecca tried to steady him, but the bond between them was no longer unbreakably, was fraying with every passing hour. In the end, it wasn't evidence alone that broke the case, but Daniel himself. Haunted and unable to silence the weight of his father's memory, he confessed, his words spilling out with the rawness of someone desperate to escape his own conscience. His admission dragged Rebecca down with him, exposing the affair, the manipulation, and the twisted plan that had ended in blood. When the trial began, the shocking details shattered the image of a respectable family. The story of a stepmother seducing her husband's son and driving him to murder was almost too grotesque to believe. Yet every word came to light in court. Rebecca sat in silence, her face carefully composed, while Daniel trembled under the weight of his own testimony. One had orchestrated, the other had acted. But both stood equally guilty in the eyes of justice. The Harper household that once seemed enviable became infamous. Its walls remembered not for love or warmth, but for betrayal and death. What began as an affair hidden in whispers ended in tragedy, a story so twisted it seemed torn from fiction, yet rooted in the darkest corners of human desire and control.